everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
So today we're going to be tackling something that was actually a listener request.
Oh,
And it's a pretty heavy topic, honestly. It's the Assyrian Genocide.
Oh, wow.
Which, honestly, even for me, is one of those things that I know kind of the basics of, but I need to brush up on myself.
For sure.
So I think this will be a good one for all of us to kind of learn together. And
Absolutely.
obviously, to help me with this, we have our resident history expert here.
Hey, everybody.
Who is me.
Ready to unpack this one with me?
Oh, yeah. I'm excited for this one.
All right, so
Let's do it.
when we talk about the Assyrian Genocide,
Okay.
we're talking about World War I, we're talking about the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
But this wasn't the only genocide that was happening at this time, right?
No, sadly not. You had the Armenian genocide and also the Greek genocide happening at the same time.
And it sounds like just from kind of that basic overview.
Yeah. It was a really difficult time in the Ottoman Empire. And
Sure.
sounds like certain leaders had a very specific and kind of dangerous vision for what they wanted it to be.
Yeah, you could say that.
So where do the Assyrians fit into all of this?
Right, so the Assyrians were a Christian ethnic group,
Hmm.
and they had ancient roots in Mesopotamia.
Okay.
So think modern day, like
Yeah.
Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran,
Yeah.
kind of in that area.
Okay, got it.
And they were a pretty diverse group. You know, they had different denominations within Christianity, but
Okay.
that shared faith is going to be a key factor in all of this.
So we're already seeing some potential for religious tension here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, unlike maybe some other groups,
Right.
it sounds like the Assyrians weren't a unified political force.
Right. They were really spread out across the entire empire. So,
Okay,
and that made them more vulnerable.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the source material mentions that there was already some persecution happening even before we get to like the official start of the genocide.
Yeah, for sure.
What was going on during those decades?
Yeah. So think like decades of just escalating violence and discrimination.
Wow.
You know, going back to the late 1800s, you had massacres that were specifically targeting Christians.
Okay.
And then in the lead up to World War I, you had, land seizures, forced conversions attacks from Turkish authorities and also Kurdish raiders.
Oh, wow.
So this is constant state of fear.
So it sounds like it wasn't just like all of a sudden everything exploded.
Right.
It was kind of a slow burn that led up to something horrific.
It was like this buildup of tension for sure.
Got it. And then you said at the start of the war, we have the rise of Turkish nationalism.
Yeah.
And that's where we get Talat Pasha, the Ottoman leader.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he seems to be a key figure here.
Oh, for sure. He wanted this ethnically and religiously homogenous Turkish empire.
Okay.
So minorities, especially Christians like the Assyrians, were seen as obstacles
Got it.
to that vision.
So that's where we get this decree ordering the deportation of Assyrians.
Exactly.
Right. Pushing them away from the borders with Russia and Iran.
Yep. And you can't think of this as just some resettlement program.
Right.
This was a calculated move to destroy the Assyrians.
Wow.
Separating communities, dissolving their identity,
Okay.
scattering them to make them easier to control.
Kind of like that old saying, divide and conquer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you could say that.
Yeah.
And they even specified in the decree that no more than 20 Assyrians could live in one place.
Wow.
So they were really trying to fragment them,
Really break down their
social structures.
Yeah, their sense of community.
Yeah,
So October 1914, these deportations begin.
right.
What did that actually look like?
So think like brutal death marches
Okay.
through harsh terrain. So very similar to what the Armenians were going through.
Got it.
Driven from their homes, forced to walk for miles with barely any food or water.
Yeah.
Many of them died just from exhaustion, starvation disease.
That's awful.
It was just horrific.
And it's important to remember that the Armenian genocide was happening at the same time.
Of course, yeah.
So for listeners who are interested in that, we did a whole other deep dive on that a while back.
Right.
But
Good point.
a lot of parallels there.
Definitely.
And tragically, it sounds like even fleeing to Iran wasn't a safe bet for a lot of the Assyrians.
No, it
Yeah.
wasn't. And you think like crossing a border would offer some kind of protection.
Right. You would think.
You would think, but
Yeah.
the Ottoman forces actually pursued them into Iran.
Wow.
They were relentless.
So really nowhere to turn?
Yeah, it was a desperate situation.
Now, the source material brings up something that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
Which is the role of Russia in all this.
Yeah,
Can you explain that a bit?
sure. So Russia saw an opportunity here to weaken the Ottoman Empire,
Okay.
which was their enemy at the time.
Right.
So they provided weapons and support to both Armenians and Assyrians who were willing to fight alongside them.
So for some Assyrians, this must have felt like a lifeline, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
A chance to fight back.
Yeah, a chance to resist.
But it sounds like this involvement also had some really tragic consequences.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Ugh.
Well, any Assyrian village that was even suspected of collaborating with Russia
Okay.
faced brutal retaliation from the Ottomans.
Wow.
I mean, entire communities were destroyed, regardless of whether they had actually fought alongside the Russians or not.
So kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. It was a very difficult situation for them.
And just to highlight how brutal that Ottoman response was.
Yeah.
The video mentions this chilling three-word order,
Right.
Yak vor Alor,
Yeah.
which means burn, demolish, kill.
It really sums it up.
Yeah, chilling is right.
Yeah.
It makes it really clear this wasn't about relocation.
No.
It was about wiping them out.
It was about extermination.
And amidst all of this, we also have so many individual stories of suffering.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The video talks about Judah Abova,
Right.
who was forced to watch her children and husband executed
Oh, it's heartbreaking.
in their village after they refused to convert to Islam.
Yeah.
Just
I-
awful.
Yeah, those personal accounts are really what bring it home.
Yeah. You really can't forget the human cost of this.
You can't.
So we have the deportations. We have the reprisals for resistance.
Right.
Where were some of the worst atrocities concentrated?
So the Hakkari Mountains and the areas around Lake Urmia were particularly hard hit
Okay,
because these regions had really large Assyrian populations.
got it.
And the violence there was very intense.
The video mentions something about Lake Urmia
Oh, yeah.
that really stuck with me.
It's awful. There are accounts of women who tried to escape the Ottoman soldiers
Okay.
by swimming out into the lake,
Oh, no.
only to be shot and left to drown.
Jeez.
Just,
This lake that was once a thriving center of Assyrian life
right.
becomes this
Yeah.
site of horrific violence.
It's a symbol of the destruction.
And it wasn't just happening randomly.
Right.
Right, we had specific figures who were orchestrating this.
Like Jevdet Bey.
Right, the governor of Van Province.
Yeah.
He was ruthless.
The source material describes how he tricked Armenian and Assyrian men in this town of Halavan
Right.
to gather for what they thought was food distribution.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I can see where this is going.
Yeah, it was a trap.
Oh my gosh.
He had them rounded up and executed. And to save ammunition, they actually beat the prisoners to death with tools and farming equipment.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I mean, they were nicknamed the Butcher Battalion for a reason.
That's awful. And this wasn't happening in secret.
No, it wasn't.
The video mentions that Western media was reporting on it.
Right.
Even the Iranian government condemned it.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't hidden from the world.
Wow.
There were diplomats witnessing this.
And yet it still continued.
Yeah,
It's like the world was watching, but unable or unwilling to act.
yeah. Sadly, that's a pattern we see throughout history.
It's very frustrating.
It is.
But even in the face of this horror, we do see some incredible acts of resistance.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And one figure that really stands out is Morshimun.
Right, the leader of the Assyrian Church of the East.
Yeah.
He was incredible.
The video mentions that he initially tried diplomacy,
He did.
even wrote to Jevdet Bey to plead for an end to the persecution.
Yeah, but when that failed,
Right.
he turned to the Russians for help
Okay.
and rallied the Assyrians to defend themselves.
And then the Ottomans threatened to execute his brother
Yeah.
if he didn't instruct the Assyrians to surrender.
It was a horrible choice.
What an impossible decision.
And his response is just incredible.
What did he say?
He said, "My people are my family. They are many, and my brother is just one.
Wow.
Let him give his life for his nation."
That's true leadership right there.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So under his leadership, we see the Assyrians in the Hakkari Mountains fighting back.
Yeah, they put up a good fight.
But they couldn't hold out forever.
No, of course not.
So in June 1915,
Yeah.
facing these overwhelming Ottoman forces, the surviving Assyrians are forced to make this desperate escape into Russia.
It was a treacherous journey
Yeah, I can imagine.
through the mountains.
So many must have perished along the way.
Oh, yeah, many did.
But Morshimun and around 30,000 others did make it to safety.
They did, yeah.
Wow, that's a testament to their resilience.
It really is.
But unfortunately, the violence didn't stop there.
No, it didn't.
It was systematic
Yeah.
across the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, this was a widespread campaign.
And we still have to talk about what happened in the province of Diyarbakir.
We do, yeah.
That's where we get Mohammed Rashid Bey.
Right, the governor there.
Yeah, what made him stand out?
So he was fanatically devoted to this genocide,
Wow.
even defying orders to just focus on the Armenians.
Really?
He continued massacring Assyrians,
Oh my gosh.
and, falsely accusing them of aiding deserters and hiding weapons to kind of justify his actions.
Wow. So just incredibly cruel.
Yeah, I mean, beyond cruel.
And were his methods just as brutal as Jevdet Bey's?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're talking mass imprisonments, executions.
Okay.
There's one instance where he tricked hundreds of imprisoned Christians
Okay.
into thinking they were being deported to Mosul.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and he even had them singing as they marched to the boats.
You've got to be kidding me.
But instead of taking them to Mosul, they were led to a valley and massacred.
Oh, my gosh.
And then to add insult to injury,
What?
his authorities sent letters to their families claiming they had arrived safely.
That's awful. It's mind-boggling how cruel someone can be.
It really is.
And it wasn't even just his own troops, right?
No, he organized these volunteer militias,
Okay.
essentially death squads,
Wow.
to wipe out entire towns and villages.
And at the peak of this, how many were being murdered?
Oh, tens of thousands every month.
My God.
It was just a systematic extermination campaign.
It's hard to believe there could be any stories of hope amidst all of this.
Right.
But the video does mention a few instances of successful resistance.
It does, yeah.
So tell me about those.
Okay, so one example is the defense of Ain Wardo.
Okay.
So this village was flooded with refugees from earlier attacks,
Okay.
and they used the ancient village walls as their defense,
Art.
and they formed this militia.
Wow.
And for 2 months, they held off a much larger force of Ottoman troops and Kurdish raiders.
2 months?
Yeah, it's incredible.
That's amazing.
They were so resilient that the Ottomans actually tried to negotiate with them,
Wow.
but the Assyrians refused to disarm.
Good for them.
And so eventually the Ottomans withdrew.
What a victory.
Yeah, it was a huge victory for them.
Were there any other successful defenses?
Yeah, Isaac is another one.
Okay.
It's another kind of David and Goliath story.
Okay.
A small band of Assyrian militia,
Okay.
calling themselves the Jesus Fidi,
Wow.
defended their town against this massive Ottoman and Kurdish force for months.
Wow.
They inflicted heavy casualties. They forced the Ottomans to divert troops
Jeez.
and even made them consider requesting assistance from Germany.
Wow. Did the Germans help?
They actually refused.
Ah, wow.
Yeah. And in the end, the Ottomans retreated after suffering these heavy losses.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so Azak became this symbol of Assyrian resistance.
That's so inspiring, especially given the overwhelming odds they were facing.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But it seems like, sadly, the genocide itself didn't have a clear end date.
No, it didn't. Killings and deportations continued through 1915 and even after.
Wow.
And even more Shamoun, that brave leader we talked about,
Yeah.
he was assassinated in 1918,
Wow.
just months before the Ottoman Empire collapsed.
It's like they were targeted right up until the very end.
Yeah, it was relentless.
But with the fall of the Ottoman government, could the Assyrians finally start to rebuild?
Yeah, but the scars run deep, you know.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to process the loss of so many loved ones, the destruction of your homes, your culture.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to grasp the magnitude of it all.
It really is.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom the scale of that loss, right?
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of lives, and we're talking about more than just the physical toll here.
Absolutely. This was about wiping out their entire culture.
The Assyrians had a heritage that stretched back centuries.
Centuries,
Right.
art, music, literature.
And they were the keepers of this ancient language, Aramaic.
Right.
You know, the language Jesus spoke.
Exactly.
It's just wild to think that a language spoken by Jesus is now endangered because of this genocide.
I know, it's crazy to think about, right?
Yeah?
Entire communities of speakers were wiped out with them, centuries of tradition.
Wow.
Churches and monasteries, some dating back to the early days of Christianity, were looted and destroyed.
So this wasn't just about killing people.
Right.
This was about erasing their very identity.
Exactly.
And that cultural destruction is still being felt today, right?
It is. I mean, Aramaic is hanging on by a thread, spoken only in these scattered pockets.
It's just so much knowledge and history
It's
loss.
tragic.
What about the survivors, those who managed to escape the massacres, the death marches? Where did they end up?
So many fled to neighboring countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria. Some made it further afield to Europe and the United States.
I can't imagine starting over in a new land after experiencing that kind of trauma.
It was incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
They faced language barriers, cultural differences, the struggle to rebuild their lives,
Right.
all while carrying the psychological scars of the genocide.
And that trauma gets passed down through generations too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even today, Assyrian communities around the world are dealing with this legacy.
It's a collective memory of suffering, a
Yeah.
sense of loss, and a fear that it could happen
A
again.
fear that it could happen again, exactly.
Which brings us to a really important question. What's the situation for Assyrians in the Middle East today? Are they still facing persecution?
Sadly,
Uh,
yes. In Iraq, they've been targeted by extremist groups, and in Syria, the ongoing civil war has displaced many Assyrian communities.
So the same vulnerabilities that made them targets back then still exist.
They do.
That's why this fight for recognition is so important.
I completely agree. It's not just about acknowledging the past, but it's about protecting the future.
Making sure the world knows what happened, so hopefully it
Yeah.
never happens again.
Exactly.
Watching that Day in History video, what really struck me was the role of religion in all of this.
Yeah.
The Assyrians were targeted specifically because they were Christian.
Right. It was definitely a key factor. The Ottoman government under Talat Pasha had this vision of a purely Turkish Muslim state,
Okay.
and Christians were seen as a threat to that vision.
It's scary how religious differences can be twisted to justify violence and hatred.
It really is. It highlights the danger of religious extremism and why dialogue and understanding between faiths is so important.
Absolutely.
We have to remember that our shared humanity should always come before our differences.
For sure. And it's also important to remember that all of this was happening during World War I.
Right.
The Ottoman Empire was crumbling. There was a lot of fear, paranoia.
Yeah. Wartime can bring out the worst in people.
Right.
Chaos and instability create this breeding ground for scapegoating.
And in this case, Christians were painted as disloyal, a threat to national security.
Exactly. Which, of course, was unfounded.
Totally.
But in times of war, logic and reason often take a back seat to fear and propaganda.
Yeah. It's chilling how quickly an entire group of people can be demonized like that.
It is. And that's why it's so important to study these events, to understand the warning signs, and to challenge prejudice and discrimination whenever we see it.
So after diving into this really dark chapter of history, where do we go from here? How do we make sure the memory of the Assyrian genocide is preserved and that lessons are learned?
I think education is key.
Okay.
We need to make sure this genocide is included in history curricula,
Yeah,
that it's taught accurately and with sensitivity.
for sure.
We need to support research and documentation efforts so the full story is told
Right.
and understood.
And keep pushing for official recognition.
Oh, absolutely. Turkey's continued denial is a huge obstacle to justice and reconciliation.
Yeah.
It needs to be acknowledged so healing can truly begin.
The more people who know about this, the harder it will be to deny it or dismiss it.
Exactly.
And beyond just recognition, there's also the question of reparations.
Right.
Right, the Assyrian community suffered immense losses, both material and cultural.
Absolutely.
So what would reparations even look like in this case?
Well, it could involve financial compensation for property that was seized or destroyed.
Okay.
During the genocide, it could also mean support for revitalizing their culture.
Right.
Language preservation programs, restoration of historical sites,
That makes sense.
things like that.
And there's that psychological component too, right?
Of course.
Addressing the trauma that's been passed down through generations.
Yeah, acknowledging the suffering and providing support for healing is crucial.
It's a long and complex process,
It is,
but an important one.
but an important one for sure.
This all feels so big, though. What can one person actually do to make a difference? I know we've got listeners out there who are probably feeling the weight of all this.
Yeah, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, but every action counts.
Okay.
You can share information about the genocide with your friends and family.
All right.
Support organizations that are working to preserve Assyrian culture and heritage.
Yeah.
Write to your elected officials, urging them to officially recognize the genocide.
Okay.
If you're able to donate to charities that are providing humanitarian aid to Assyrians in need,
Yeah.
even just seeking out opportunities to learn more about Assyrian history and culture can make a difference.
Okay.
Yeah, there are museums, cultural centers, tons of resources online.
It's about building those bridges of understanding and empathy.
It is.
It's about remembering that the Assyrian people are not just victims of this tragedy, but a vibrant community
Right.
with a rich culture that deserves to be celebrated and protected.
Well said.
This whole deep dive has been really informative, but also emotionally heavy.
Yeah, it's tough to confront this kind of darkness,
Yeah.
but it's so necessary.
It is. It reminds us how fragile peace can be and how important it is to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
Absolutely.
We talked a lot about the historical context, but I'm curious to hear your perspective on the relevance of the Assyrian genocide to the world today.
Oh.
What lessons can we take away from this tragedy that apply to current events?
That's a really important question. And sadly, the world is still full of conflict and violence.
Yeah.
We see ethnic and religious minorities being persecuted all over the place.
It seems like we haven't learned anything.
Sometimes it feels that way, but
Hmm.
I think the Assyrian genocide and all genocides really serve as these stark warnings.
Okay.
They show us what can happen when hatred goes unchecked
Right.
and how easily peace can be shattered.
So we have to constantly be on guard against prejudice and discrimination.
We have a moral obligation to speak out against injustice and protect those who are vulnerable.
It's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, the sheer scale of the problems in the world. But those stories of resistance we talked about earlier, they give me a sliver of hope.
Me too. Those Assyrians who defended their villages, those who rebuilt their lives in exile,
Yeah.
they show us the incredible strength of the human spirit.
It's that reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and resilience can prevail,
They can.
and that even small acts of courage and compassion can make a difference.
Absolutely.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
Before we wrap up part 2, is there anything else you feel is crucial for our listeners to understand?
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that the Assyrian genocide isn't just a historical event.
Okay.
It's an ongoing tragedy.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, the consequences are still being felt today.
Yeah.
The Assyrian community is still fragmented, their cultural heritage is still threatened,
Right.
and they're still fighting for recognition and justice.
So it's not just about remembering the past, it's about taking action in the present.
Exactly. We need to stand with the Assyrian community as they rebuild and heal.
Yeah.
We need to fight for their rights and make sure they're never subjected to such horrors again.
It's about solidarity. It is. Yeah.
Standing with those who've been marginalized and oppressed.
Well said.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about. It's been intense, emotional, but ultimately, I'm grateful to have learned more about this topic.
Me too. I hope our listeners feel the same way.
I'm sure they do. This is something that deserves our attention, our reflection, and our action.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, let's take a break and come back for the final part of our deep dive into the Assyrian genocide. All right, so we're back, and we've covered a lot of heavy stuff in this deep dive.
Yeah, we have.
The historical context, the horrific events, the ongoing impact.
Right.
I mean, it's a lot to process.
It is.
But I think it's so important to end on a note of action.
Absolutely.
So knowing everything we know now, what can we actually do
Right.
to prevent something like this from happening again?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Preventing genocide is this massive challenge,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think it starts with each of us,
What do you mean?
I mean, like becoming aware of those dangerous patterns.
Okay. Like intolerance, prejudice, discrimination, and then calling them out.
Yeah.
Not just like in the world, but in our own lives, our communities.
Right.
We have to be vigilant.
It's like that saying the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing.
Exactly. Silence is complicity.
Yeah.
We have to speak up against injustice.
Right.
Support organizations that are fighting for human rights. Hold our leaders accountable. All those things matter.
And it's so easy to feel like one person can't make a difference, but it's really those individual actions
Yeah.
that build up to create change, right?
They do. It's like ripples in a pond, right?
Yeah.
One small action can spread outwards, influence others.
I like that.
So don't underestimate the power of, your voice, your choices, your actions.
We talked a lot about remembering the Assyrian Genocide.
We did, yeah.
How do we make sure that remembrance is active and not just passive?
Oh, that's a good point.
How do we make it a force for good in the world?
Remembrance has to be tied to action. It can't just be about feeling sad or outraged,
Right. We have to channel those feelings into something positive.
So what does that look like practically?
I mean, there's so many ways to do that. You could support Assyrian cultural initiatives.
Okay.
You could donate to organizations that are preserving their language and heritage,
Yeah.
advocate for their rights on a global stage.
Even just listening to the stories of survivors,
Yeah.
amplifying their voices, letting them know they're not forgotten.
Absolutely. Empathy and solidarity are huge.
Right.
They create space for healing, for understanding, for building bridges between communities.
One thing that I've been thinking about is how important it is to talk about this with the younger generation.
I agree.
Like connecting survivors with young people so they can hear those firsthand accounts.
Oh, those personal stories have a way of cutting through the noise.
Right.
And really hitting home. They foster empathy, a deeper understanding of the human cost.
And it helps ensure that the memory of what happened stays alive even as time passes. It does. And it creates an opportunity for dialogue, for healing, for reconciliation.
Yeah.
When survivors feel heard and seen, it can help them process their trauma and move forward.
And for young people, it's a chance to learn from the past and commit to building a better future.
It is. It's about creating this shared narrative.
Yeah.
A story that honors the victims, acknowledges the suffering, but also inspires hope.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this mix of emotions.
Yeah.
Sadness, obviously, for the immense loss that the Assyrian people have endured,
Right.
but also hope that by learning from this tragedy,
Yeah.
we can prevent it from happening again.
I feel that too. The Assyrian Genocide is this stark reminder of how fragile peace is and how crucial it is to stand up for what's right.
May their memory be a blessing and a call to action for all of us.
Absolutely.
Thanks to everyone for joining us on this journey of learning and reflection.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
We hope that this deep dive has inspired you to learn more about the Assyrian Genocide and to become advocates for peace and justice in your own way.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll see you in the next one.